August 1944. A requisitioned chateau 15 kilometers east of Chartres. The windows face west, toward Normandy, toward the beaches where 2 months earlier the world changed. Inside, a German intelligence officer leans over a table scattered with reconnaissance photographs. His colleagues crowd behind him, their boots scuffing the parquet floor that once hosted French aristocrats. The photos show roads, just roads, but roads so thick with vehicles they look like rivers of steel flowing east across France. One officer laughs. It starts as a chuckle, then spreads through the room like a contagion. "Look at this," he says in German, tapping a photograph.
Chaos, no military discipline.
Trucks everywhere, no organization. He lights a cigarette, shaking his head. The Americans don't understand logistics. They simply throw material at every problem and hope it works. Another officer nods, smirking. Amateur hour. The Soviets at least learned from us. These Americans? They're children playing with toys. The intelligence officer gathers the photos, filing them away. Outside, the sound of distant artillery rolls across the French countryside like summer thunder. The Germans don't know it yet, but they're looking at photographs of the most successful logistical operation in military history. They're looking at the Red Ball Express, and they're looking at their own defeat. To understand why German generals laughed, you have to understand what the United States Army looked like before the war. In 1939, the American military ranked 17th in the world by size. Smaller than Romania's, smaller than Portugal's. The U.S. Army possessed 174,000 men, 300 obsolete tanks, and a logistical doctrine designed for supplying isolated frontier posts, not continental warfare. American staff officers studied European campaigns the way academics study ancient history. Interesting, theoretical, irrelevant to their peacetime reality. The Germans, by contrast, had written the modern book on military logistics. Their invasion of Poland in September 1939 demonstrated unprecedented coordination between armored spearheads and supply columns. The Blitzkrieg wasn't just about tanks. It was about fuel trucks arriving exactly when and where panzers needed them. By 1941, Wehrmacht logisticians were managing supply lines stretching from France to the outskirts of Moscow, a masterpiece of planning executed across thousands of kilometers of hostile territory. They had learned through blood and diesel that modern mechanized warfare consumed resources at rates that would have been incomprehensible to Napoleon or Frederick the Great. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. The sleeping giant didn't just wake up, it transformed. Within 18 months, the United States was producing more war material than all Axis powers combined. Assembly lines in Detroit that once built civilian automobiles now churned out tanks. Shipyards in California launched Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. But production is one thing. Getting those supplies to the soldiers who need them, that's the invisible art that wins wars. By June 6, 1944, the Allies had solved the first impossible problem, landing on Fortress Europe. D-Day put 156,000 men on French soil in a single day, supported by the most elaborate supply plan ever conceived. The Mulberry Harbors, artificial ports towed across the English Channel, were engineering marvels. Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, pumped fuel directly from England to France beneath the waves. For the first weeks after D-Day, everything worked. Supplies flowed, the beachhead expanded, and Allied forces ground their way through the Norman hedgerows exactly as planned. Then came the breakout. Late July 1944, Operation Cobra shattered the German defensive line. Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, exploded through the gap like a cavalry charge from an earlier century. By August 15th, the Allies had closed the Falaise Pocket, destroying 2 entire German armies. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. By August 31st, the Seine was crossed. The Germans were running, the Allies were chasing, and suddenly nobody was where they were supposed to be. The supply plan collapsed not from failure but from success. Planners had assumed a methodical advance, perhaps reaching the German border by May 1945. Instead, Allied armies covered distances in days that were supposed to take months. Each mile east meant one more mile the supply trucks had to travel, and those miles added up with mathematical brutality. Consider the numbers. An infantry division in static defense consumed 200 tons of supplies per day. That same division on the attack consumed 700 tons. An armored division pushing forward burned through 1,000 tons daily. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies, engineering equipment. By early September 1944, the Allies had 36 divisions racing across France. Do the math. Tens of thousands of tons every single day, traveling hundreds of miles from Normandy beaches to frontline units approaching the German frontier. The ports couldn't handle it. Cherbourg, captured in late June, had been systematically demolished by German engineers before surrender. The harbor was choked with sunken ships, the cranes destroyed, the facilities sabotaged so thoroughly it took weeks just to begin repairs. The Normandy beaches, those engineering marvels of D-Day, were never designed for sustained long-term supply operations. Rough seas in late August damaged the Mulberry harbors beyond repair. The nearest major deep-water port was Antwerp. But Antwerp was still in German hands, and even after its eventual capture, the Scheldt estuary leading to it would remain contested for months, so the trucks drove. And drove. And drove. From Normandy to the front, then back again in endless cycles. But by mid-August, even the trucks were breaking down under impossible demands. Patton's Third Army, driving hard toward the German border, was consuming 400,000 gallons of gasoline per day. The supply convoys couldn't keep up. Tank columns were grinding to a halt with empty fuel tanks within sight of the Rhine. The greatest military advance in history was about to stall, not from German resistance, but from empty gas cans. Modern war is arithmetic. A single Sherman tank travels roughly 1 mile per 5 gallons of gasoline. An infantry division's trucks, jeeps, and support vehicles consume 60,000 gallons per day on the move. Multiply that across armies, across army groups, and the numbers become almost abstract. But those abstractions meant everything to the men at the front. A rifle without ammunition is a club. A tank without fuel is a roadblock. An army without supplies is a mob. By August 21, 1944, the situation had reached crisis level. Patton's Third Army had advanced so rapidly, it was now over 400 miles from Normandy, roughly the distance from New York to Richmond. Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north faced similar distances. Every gallon of fuel consumed by a supply truck was a gallon that couldn't go to a combat vehicle. The supply officers called it the tyranny of distance. Eisenhower called it a nightmare. The standard supply route from Normandy to the front took 3 days round trip under ideal conditions. But conditions were never ideal. French roads, built for civilian traffic and German occupation forces, were disintegrating under American heavy trucks. Entire sections of highway simply collapsed under the weight of endless convoys. Bridges built for farm carts groaned under 5-ton cargo trucks. Traffic jams stretched for miles. Trucks broke down, blocking roads, creating cascading delays that rippled through the entire supply network. And there were never enough trucks, never. The Allied invasion plan called for 240 truck companies to support operations in France. By late August, with armies far beyond their planned positions, commanders were screaming for double that number. Vehicles were being cannibalized for spare parts. Drivers were working shifts that would have been criminal in peacetime. 16, 18, 20 hours at the wheel, then a few hours of sleep before starting again. On August 21st, senior logistics officers from SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, gathered in an emergency meeting. The maps on the wall told a brutal story. Red pins marked supply dumps in Normandy. Blue pins marked frontline units, scattered across a front stretching from Belgium to the Loire Valley. The gap between red and blue was growing every day. Something radical had to happen, or the entire advance would simply stop. The solution they devised was both elegant and insane. A dedicated express highway for supplies only, running in a continuous one-way loop from Normandy to the front and back. No civilian traffic, no regular military traffic, just supply trucks running flat out around the clock. They would prioritize speed over everything else. No stops except for fuel, mechanical failure, or delivery. Military police would control every intersection, keeping the route clear. Trucks would travel in organized convoys, but those convoys would move fast. No more 3-day round trips. They were aiming for 2 days, maybe less. They needed a name, something that would communicate urgency, priority, absolute commitment to speed. Someone remembered the red ball system used by American railroads, express freight that got priority handling, marked with red symbols on manifests and cars. That was it. The Red Ball Express. The name went out in operational orders on August 23, 1944. The first trucks rolled on August 25th. The route stretched from Saint-Lô in Normandy, through Alençon, Chartres, and on toward Paris, then northeast toward the front. Engineers marked it with red balls painted on signs, bridges, buildings, anything visible. Massive letters on the road surface, Red Ball. 1 lane north, 1 lane south, separated by whatever distance French roads allowed. MPs stationed at every major intersection with orders to stop everything, military or civilian, to keep the red ball moving. The plan called for 132 truck companies, roughly 6,000 vehicles. Each truck would carry 5 tons of supplies. If they could maintain the cycle running continuously, they could deliver 12,500 tons per day to the front. It was ambitious. It was unprecedented, and it was the only option left. Finding the trucks was the easy part. Finding the drivers was harder. The army was stretched thin across France, fighting a mobile campaign that consumed manpower as fast as it consumed fuel. Every able-bodied soldier was needed somewhere. Infantry replacements, tank crews, artillery units, engineers. But driving trucks? That was considered non-combat duty, something that could be assigned to units the army didn't quite know what to do with, which meant the Red Ball Express would be driven primarily by African-American soldiers. In 1944, the U.S. Army was still segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, often relegated to service and supply roles rather than combat positions. They loaded ships, built roads, drove trucks, buried the dead. The irony was cruel and obvious. Men fighting for freedom abroad while denied full citizenship at home. But they volunteered anyway. Thousands of them. Some saw it as a chance to prove themselves. Others simply wanted to contribute to victory. Many just wanted to serve alongside their white countrymen, even if the army kept them in separate units. On August 25, 1944, the first Red Ball convoy rolled out of Saint-Lô, 40 trucks, loaded with jerry cans of gasoline and crates of ammunition, their bumpers freshly stenciled with Red Ball insignia. The drivers were mostly men from the 3696th, 3257th, and 514th Quartermaster truck companies, units that had been driving supplies since D-Day, but never like this. Never with this urgency, this priority, this weight of expectation. The German intelligence officer at Chartres would have watched some of those first convoys pass. Perhaps he took more photographs. Perhaps he filed another report noting the increased traffic. But he was still laughing. They all were. Because what the Germans saw was chaos, improvisation, desperate measures, the Americans throwing trucks at a problem instead of proper military planning. What they didn't see was capacity. What they didn't understand was that American strength had never been tactical elegance. It was industrial weight. It was the ability to build 6,000 trucks and find 23,000 men to drive them and keep them running and do it all in a matter of days, not months. The Red Ball Express wasn't a sign of American logistical weakness. It was a preview of how the war would end. Angle 1. The human factor. The men who drove the Red Ball were invisible to history for decades. Their names rarely appeared in after-action reports. Their photographs were filed away in archives, uncelebrated. But in August 1944, they were the lifeline of the Allied advance, and most of them were Black Private James Rookard, 3257th Quartermaster Truck Company, was 22 years old when he volunteered for Red Ball duty. He'd grown up in Alabama, where he couldn't vote, couldn't eat in most restaurants, couldn't sit in the front of a bus. Now he was in France, driving a 5-ton GMC truck loaded with artillery shells, racing through the night toward men who needed those shells to stay alive. The irony wasn't lost on him. None of the drivers missed it. They were fighting for a country that hadn't yet decided they were fully human. The segregation followed them to Europe. Black units had separate barracks, separate mess facilities, separate everything. White officers commanded most black units. The army didn't trust African Americans with leadership positions. When Red Ball drivers stopped for rest, they often found themselves directed to inferior facilities served last, treated as second class even while performing first-class duties. Some French civilians, shocked by American racism, treated the black soldiers better than their own army did. French families invited drivers into their homes, shared meals, expressed gratitude that must have felt strange to men who'd never experienced it from white Americans. But they drove anyway. Not for the recognition. They knew that wasn't coming. Not for the glory. Truck drivers don't get medals like infantrymen. They drove because the job mattered. Because Patton's tanks couldn't move without fuel, and those fuel trucks needed drivers, and here they were. Some of the men spoke about it years later. In oral histories recorded long after the war, they talked about pride, about proving something, about wanting to be part of victory even if victory didn't fully include them yet. Technical Sergeant William Scott, another Red Ball driver, remembered the exhaustion most vividly. "You'd drive until you couldn't see straight," he said in a 1981 interview. "Then you'd pull over for 4 hours, sleep right there in the cab, and start again. We took Benzedrine tablets to stay awake. Army issued them. Little white pills. They kept you going, but you paid for it later. Shaking hands, couldn't eat, felt like your heart would explode. But the front needed supplies, so you took the pills and you drove. The danger was constant but mundane, not German attacks. The Luftwaffe was largely grounded by late summer 1944, and German ground forces were too busy retreating to waste time on supply convoys. The danger was exhaustion, mechanical failure, and physics. A 5-ton truck traveling at 40 miles per hour becomes a missile when the driver falls asleep. Crashes happened daily. Trucks rolled into ditches, collided with each other, jackknifed on rain-slick roads. Some drivers were killed outright. Others were maimed, crushed legs, shattered spines, traumatic brain injuries. The hospitals in Normandy filled with Red Ball casualties who would never be counted as combat losses. Angle 2. The technical challenge. The GMC CCKW E12-ton 6x6 truck, universally called the Jimmy, or the Deuce and a Half, was the workhorse of the Red Ball Express. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't innovative. It was just solid, reliable, mass-produced American engineering. 6-wheel drive for rough terrain, 270 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine, producing 104 horsepower. Top speed of 45 miles per hour on good roads, less when loaded. It could carry 5 tons if you didn't mind wearing out the suspension. The Army had ordered over 500,000 of them. But reliable doesn't mean indestructible. The Red Ball pushed these trucks far beyond their design specifications. They were supposed to be maintained every 1,000 miles. Oil changes, brake inspections, tire rotations, the whole peacetime routine. Red Ball trucks were covering 400 miles round trip every 2 days. The math was brutal. After just 5 trips, a truck needed maintenance. But there was no time for maintenance. There was only driving. Mechanics worked miracles. Mobile maintenance units set up along the Red Ball route, trying to perform repairs while convoys rolled past continuously. They changed tires on trucks that had been driven until the rubber literally melted. They rebuilt engines that should have been condemned. They cannibalized broken-down trucks for parts to keep others running. A mechanic from the 582nd Ordnance Company remembered replacing a truck's entire clutch assembly in 2 hours, working by flashlight in the rain, because that truck was due back on the road and there were no replacements available. Tires failed constantly. The French roads, already deteriorating, were being pulverized by thousands of heavy trucks. Sharp stones, debris, shell fragments, all of it shredded rubber. Each truck carried 2 spare tires, but drivers often burned through both spares on a single trip. They'd limp into supply dumps on rims, metal grinding on pavement, sparks flying, and beg for new tires that didn't exist. Tire shortages became so severe that priority cargo manifests listed tires alongside ammunition and medical supplies. Fuel was its own absurdity. The Red Ball existed to transport fuel to the front, but the trucks themselves consumed enormous quantities. A loaded GMC CCKW got roughly 4 miles per gallon. On a 400-mile round trip, each truck burned 100 gallons just to deliver its cargo. When that cargo was fuel, say 50 jerry cans of gasoline, the truck was consuming a fifth of what it carried just to transport it. The logistics officers ran the numbers and felt ill. But what else could they do? The alternative was tanks sitting motionless while German defenses solidified. The one-way loop system was supposed to eliminate inefficiency, and it did mostly. Trucks traveled north loaded, south empty, never crossing paths, never creating traffic jams. MPs at intersections could time the convoys like railroad schedules. But perfection was impossible. A broken-down truck could halt an entire convoy. A washed-out bridge forced detours that added hours. Driver error, medical emergencies, blown engines. Every failure cascaded through the system. Angle 3. The route itself, Highway N12 from Normandy toward Paris, had been built for civilian traffic, not military conquest. 2 lanes mostly, winding through small French towns, crossing rivers on stone bridges erected decades or centuries earlier. In peacetime, perhaps a few hundred vehicles traveled it daily. Now it carried thousands per day, every day around the clock, vehicles weighing tons more than the road had ever been designed to support. The pavement disintegrated. Literally. By September, entire sections of the Red Ball route had been ground down to gravel, then to dirt, then to mud pits that swallowed trucks axle deep. Engineer battalions worked constantly, laying gravel, pouring concrete, reinforcing bridges, but they couldn't keep pace with the destruction. One engineering officer compared it to trying to fill a bathtub while someone keeps pulling the drain plug. Signs marked every mile. Red Ball Express, stay on the ball, keep 'em rolling. Military police manned every intersection with absolute authority. A general in his staff car wanting to cross the Red Ball route. Wait. A column of tanks needing to move laterally. Wait. Civilians trying to return to liberated homes. Wait. Nothing interrupted the Red Ball. MPs carried sidearms and had orders to use them if necessary to keep the route clear. It never came to that, but the authority was real and everyone knew it. The French watched with a mixture of awe and concern as the endless convoys rumbled through their towns. American trucks shook medieval buildings to their foundations. Exhaust fumes choked streets that hadn't seen this level of traffic since the German invasion. But the same convoys brought liberation, so complaints were muted. Some French civilians set up impromptu cafes along the route, selling coffee and food to drivers during brief stops. Others simply stood and waved, offering silent gratitude to the men who were pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Germany. At night, the Red Ball became surreal. Blackout regulations prohibited headlights, but thousands of trucks couldn't navigate French roads in complete darkness. The compromise was cat-eye lights, tiny slits covered with tape, producing just enough illumination to see the truck ahead. From a distance, the convoys looked like rivers of glowing eyes flowing through the dark. German reconnaissance planes occasionally spotted them, but by late August 1944, the Luftwaffe had bigger problems than bombing supply trucks. Weather compounded every difficulty. Late summer gave way to autumn and the rains came. French roads, already damaged, became streams of mud. Visibility dropped to nothing. Trucks slid off roads, jackknifed, collided in the fog. Drivers who'd been pushing through exhaustion now battled nature itself. Some convoys took 12 hours to cover distances they'd managed in 6 hours the week before, but they kept moving because stopping meant defeat. Angle 4. The German perspective Oberst Heinrich Müller, Luftwaffe Reconnaissance Section, filed his report on September 3, 1944, from a temporary headquarters outside Metz. His tone was professional, but the subtext was clear. Something unprecedented was happening in the American rear areas. His reconnaissance flights over northern France had photographed supply columns stretching for dozens of kilometers. Unbroken lines of trucks moving east, then empty trucks moving west. A circulatory system pumping material toward the front with mechanical precision. The Wehrmacht intelligence staff studied the photographs with growing unease. This wasn't the improvised chaos they'd seen in earlier American operations. This was organized, systematic, relentless. One analyst calculated the tonnage moving through those convoys and double-checked his math, certain he'd made an error. He hadn't. The Americans were moving more supplies in a single day than an entire German army group consumed in a week. German commanders had built their entire strategic doctrine around a fundamental assumption, that Allied supply lines would become overextended during any rapid advance, creating opportunities for counterattack. It had worked against the Soviets in 1941. It had worked against the British in North Africa. It should have been working now. Patton's Third Army was hundreds of kilometers from its supply base, operating at the end of a logistical tether that should have been strangling. Yet Patton kept advancing. General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Rommel until Rommel's wounding in July, wrote in his diary, "The Americans possess resources we cannot comprehend. Where we must choose between fuel for tanks or fuel for trucks, they simply produce more of both. Where we must ration ammunition, they fire it as if factories existed at the front. This is not war as we know it. This is industrial annihilation. The German generals weren't stupid. They understood logistics. They'd managed supply lines from France to Moscow, after all. But they'd managed those lines through meticulous planning, careful rationing, and accepting that shortages were inevitable. The American approach was alien to them. Solve supply problems not through efficiency but through overwhelming capacity. Not enough trucks? Build more trucks. Roads too damaged? Send more engineer units. Can't do it perfectly? Do it imperfectly, but do it bigger. Some German officers dismissed the Red Ball as proof of American wastefulness. They burned 4 gallons to deliver 20. One quartermaster officer noted with contempt. This is the logistics of madmen. But others saw the terrifying truth. Waste didn't matter when you had unlimited production. The Americans could afford to be inefficient because they had so much capacity that even their inefficiency exceeded German efficiency. By mid-September, Wehrmacht situation reports began acknowledging a shift. Where earlier documents had predicted Allied advances would stall due to supply problems, new assessments admitted that enemy logistics appear capable of sustaining operations indefinitely. The phrase appeared again and again in German communications. Material superiority, not tactical superiority, not strategic superiority, material superiority. The Americans had more of everything, and they could move it all faster than the Germans could destroy it. Angle 5. The numbers game. The statistics of the Red Ball Express read like industrial output reports, not military operations. Between August 25 and November 16, 1944, 83 days, Red Ball trucks delivered 412,193 tons of supplies to Allied forces. That's roughly 5,000 tons per day, every day for nearly 3 months. At peak operation in early September, they hit 12,500 tons in a single 24-hour period. To contextualize, a single ton of supplies could keep an infantry platoon fighting for a week. 5,000 tons sustained multiple divisions. The Red Ball wasn't just supporting the advance, it was enabling an entirely new scale of mobile warfare. Armies that should have paused to consolidate supply lines instead kept pushing, kept attacking, kept the Germans retreating. The human cost of those numbers was staggering. Roughly 23,000 soldiers served in Red Ball units at various points during its operation. Of those, 146 were killed in accidents. Hundreds more were injured seriously enough to require hospitalization. The fatality rate from traffic accidents alone rivaled some infantry units' combat losses. Every ton delivered carried a price measured in shattered bodies and exhausted minds. Fuel dominated the manifest sheets. Of the 412,193 tons delivered, approximately 70% was petroleum products, gasoline, diesel, oil, lubricants. The Army's thirst for fuel was insatiable. A single armored division on the attack consumed 60,000 gallons per day. Multiply that across multiple armored divisions and you're looking at 500,000 gallons daily. Just for tanks. Add the trucks, the jeeps, the half-tracks, the armored cars, and the number becomes absurd. The Red Ball existed primarily as a pipeline for liquid petroleum, hauled 5 tons at a time in jerry cans stacked in truck beds. Ammunition formed the second priority. Artillery shells, rifle rounds, machine gun belts, mortar bombs, grenades. The expenditure was astronomical. An artillery barrage in support of an infantry attack could consume 10,000 shells in an hour. Those shells weighed tons. They took up space. They needed careful handling. And they needed to be exactly where the artillery batteries needed them, exactly when they needed them. The Red Ball delivered ammunition by the trainload, except there were no trains, just thousands of trucks making thousands of trips. The maintenance burden was crushing. Of the roughly 6,000 trucks assigned to Red Ball operations at any given time, 30–40% were deadlined, too broken to drive, waiting for parts, undergoing repairs. That meant the effective fleet was closer to 4,000 trucks, which meant those 4,000 had to work even harder to meet quotas, which meant they broke down even faster. It was a death spiral of mechanical attrition that only American production capacity could sustain. Replacement trucks arrived from ports, fresh from American factories, and were immediately thrown into service. The French infrastructure paid its own price. Engineers estimated that Red Ball operations caused roughly $2 million in road damage per week, $1944, equivalent to tens of millions today. Bridges collapsed. Pavement disintegrated. Entire sections of highway had to be completely rebuilt after the war. The French government would later submit claims for reconstruction costs, but in September 1944, nobody cared about future repair bills. There was only the immediate imperative: keep the supplies moving. Angle 6. The leadership dilemma. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice, and he knew it. September 1944. The Allied armies had liberated France faster than anyone had planned. Now they stood at the German border with momentum, morale, and an enemy still reeling. But they didn't have supplies. Not enough supplies to support everyone advancing simultaneously. Someone had to get priority. Someone else had to wait. Patton, commanding Third Army, argued passionately for full supply priority. Give him the fuel and ammunition, he claimed, and he'd be across the Rhine in days into Germany's industrial heart, possibly ending the war by Christmas. Patton's argument had merit. Third Army had the momentum, the aggressive leadership, the proven ability to exploit breakthroughs. Fuel Patton and he might achieve something decisive. Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group in the north, made his own case. A concentrated thrust through the Netherlands and into Germany's northern flank, properly supplied, could cut off the Ruhr industrial region and open a path to Berlin. Montgomery's plan, Operation Market Garden, required absolute supply priority. Half measures wouldn't work. Either commit fully or don't commit at all. Eisenhower chose compromise, which meant choosing frustration for everyone. Supplies would be split, with priority shifting based on operational necessity, but no single commander receiving everything he wanted. It was the politically safe decision, the coalition-friendly decision, and the strategically cautious decision. It was also a decision that guaranteed neither Patton nor Montgomery could achieve the decisive breakthrough they promised. The Red Ball Express made Eisenhower's compromise viable, but barely. Without it, there would have been no supplies to split. No argument over priority because there would have been nothing to prioritize. The Red Ball kept everyone moving, if slowly. It bought time for ports to be repaired, for supply lines to stabilize, for the logistics situation to evolve from crisis to merely critical. But it extracted a cost from the men doing the driving. Staff officers in clean uniforms argued about supply priorities while Red Ball drivers worked 20-hour shifts, swallowed benzodrine pills, and died in crashes caused by exhaustion. The disconnect was total. Generals moved pins on maps while sergeants bled on French highways. Both were essential to victory, but only one group would be remembered. Lieutenant Colonel John Hester, commanding the 3257th Quartermaster Truck Company, wrote a letter home in September that captured the absurdity. We're told we're performing essential service. Then we're told we can't have spare parts because combat units have priority. Which is it? Are we essential or aren't we? The men are driving themselves to death and headquarters treats us like we're hauling garbage instead of winning the war. September 2, 1944. Verdun, France. General George S. Patton stood beside his command vehicle, staring at a map that showed his Third Army scattered across eastern France like a spear thrust deep into enemy territory. His forward units had reached the Meuse River. They could see the Moselle beyond. Germany was within reach, not theoretically, not eventually, but right now. And his tanks were sitting motionless with empty fuel tanks. Patton was not a man who accepted stillness gracefully. He'd been moving since the breakout from Normandy, covering distances in weeks that military planners had allocated months to achieve. His philosophy was simple: maintain momentum, keep the enemy off balance, never give them time to dig in. But philosophy doesn't power Sherman tanks. Gasoline does. And on September 2nd, Third Army's fuel reserves stood at less than 1 day's supply. The night before, Patton had received a message from Chef Logistics. Fuel deliveries would be reduced by 100,000 gallons per day. Priority was shifting north to support Montgomery's planned offensive into the Netherlands. Patton's response, recorded by his aide, is unprintable in polite company. The sanitized version: he felt Montgomery was being given resources to pursue a questionable strategy while Third Army, which had the momentum and the capability, was being starved. At that same moment, 300 miles to the west, Private James Rookard was beginning his third consecutive Red Ball run without proper rest. His logbook showed he'd driven to the front, unloaded, returned to Normandy, reloaded, and was heading east again, all in 48 hours with maybe 6 hours of sleep total. His hands shook on the steering wheel. His eyes burned. The Benzedrine tablets helped, but they also made his heart race uncomfortably. He'd seen 2 trucks crash that day, both from driver exhaustion. But the urgency was absolute. Every jerry can of fuel he carried meant another mile some tank crew could advance. The contradiction was total. Patton screaming about fuel shortages while Red Ball drivers literally killed themselves hauling fuel as fast as humanly possible. The gap wasn't in effort, it was in mathematics. Third Army needed 400,000 gallons per day to maintain offensive operations. The Red Ball at peak capacity could deliver maybe 300,000 gallons, and that assumed perfect conditions, no breakdowns, no accidents, routes that stayed open. September 2nd saw none of those conditions. A bridge collapsed near Chartres that morning. Not from enemy action, from structural failure caused by endless heavy trucks crossing it beyond its load rating. The detour added 90 minutes to every convoy's trip time. 90 minutes multiplied by dozens of convoys equals thousands of gallons undelivered. And somewhere near the German border, a tank battalion commander watched his fuel gauge drop to empty and ordered his vehicles to halt. By midday, September 3rd, elements of Third Army's 5th Infantry Division were literally pushing tanks by hand to conserve fuel. Crews dismounted, putting their shoulders against armor plating, rolling vehicles forward a few dozen yards at a time so they wouldn't be caught completely immobile if the Germans counterattacked. It was humiliating. It was exhausting. It was the inevitable consequence of advancing faster than supply lines could support. Red Ball convoy commanders received desperate priority messages: maximum speed, minimum stops, get the fuel forward now. Drivers who'd been running on fumes literally and figuratively pushed harder. Sergeant William Scott remembered passing a crashed Red Ball truck on September 3rd. Its cab crushed against a tree, 2 bodies visible inside. He didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The convoy kept rolling because stopping helped nobody, and the men in that wreck were already beyond help. He'd learn later they'd been friends of his. He'd mourn later. Right then, he just drove. September 4th brought a slight break in the crisis. A massive Red Ball effort, convoys running through the night without pause, delivered enough fuel to restart some offensive operations. Patton's tanks began moving again, though more cautiously, rationing fuel like water in a desert. They'd advance, halt to conserve fuel, advance again when the next convoy arrived. It was start-stop warfare, the opposite of everything Patton believed in, but it kept forward momentum alive. Then came September 5th, 1944. The single most productive day in Red Ball Express history. Every available truck was on the road. Maintenance schedules were ignored. If a truck could move, it moved. Drivers took double doses of Benzedrine and just drove through exhaustion into something beyond exhaustion, into a mechanical state where the body kept functioning because stopping wasn't an option. MPs cleared the routes with absolute priority, halting everything else. Engineer units worked miracles keeping damaged roads passable for a few more hours. The numbers for September 5th, 2,500 tons delivered in 24 hours. It was the peak, the absolute maximum the system could sustain. That one day delivered more supplies than some entire weeks earlier in the campaign. It represented tens of thousands of gallons of fuel, mountains of ammunition, food, medicine, spare parts, everything an advancing army needed, all concentrated into one massive logistical push. The cost was proportional to the achievement. That day saw 6 Red Ball trucks destroyed in accidents, 4 drivers killed, 11 seriously injured. Dozens more suffered minor crashes or mechanical failures that would have deadlined their vehicles if anyone had been paying attention. But nobody was paying attention to maintenance logs or safety regulations. There was only the mission: deliver supplies, keep the armies moving, maintain pressure on the retreating Wehrmacht. The German High Command received the intelligence reports from their reconnaissance aircraft and forward observation posts with something approaching disbelief. The photographs showed what should have been impossible: American supply convoys continuing to flow despite every calculation suggesting they should have collapsed by now. Wehrmacht operations officers had been predicting, hoping that the Allied advance would grind to a halt somewhere around the Meuse River. The supply lines were too long, the logistics too strained, the whole operation too ambitious. Any day now the Americans would have to pause, consolidate, give the Wehrmacht time to establish proper defensive positions. Except they didn't pause. They slowed, certainly. Patton's lightning advance became more methodical. But they never stopped. And the reason, visible in every reconnaissance photograph, was those endless truck convoys. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff at OKW, drafted an assessment on September 7th that marked a turning point in German strategic thinking. The document, recovered after the war from German archives, is remarkable for its cold clarity. The enemy possesses logistical capacity that renders traditional operational planning obsolete. Their ability to sustain offensives through improvised supply methods exceeds our ability to exploit overextension. We must assume that material superiority will compensate for any tactical advantages we achieve. Read between the lines, and Jodl was saying something profound. Germany couldn't win. Not through superior tactics, not through defensive strategy, not through any conventional military means. The Americans could make mistakes, could be inefficient, could even be wasteful, and still win through sheer material abundance. The Red Ball Express was proof. It was improvised, it was costly, it defied traditional logistics doctrine, and it worked anyway because American industrial capacity made it work. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who'd been recalled from retirement to command German forces in the West, received similar reports and came to similar conclusions. In a conversation recorded by his aide, von Rundstedt stated, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting a factory. Every position we destroy, they rebuild. Every unit we eliminate, they replace. Every gallon of fuel we deny them, they simply produce more. This is not warfare. This is industrial attrition. And we are being ground down." The psychological impact rippled through Wehrmacht ranks. German soldiers watching American supply columns roll past, even in retreat, even from a distance, understood what those columns represented. Not just material, but inevitability. The Americans could afford to waste resources on this scale because they had resources to waste. Germany, by contrast, was rationing everything. Every tank lost was irreplaceable. Every gallon of fuel was precious. Every artillery shell had to count. The asymmetry was crushing, but recognition didn't mean surrender. If anything, it hardened German defensive resolve. If they couldn't match American logistics, they'd maximize every defensive advantage. Fortifications, prepared positions, careful husbanding of resources. The German army would make the Allies pay for every mile in blood, even if logistics meant those miles would eventually be taken. It was a strategy of attrition, of making victory so expensive that perhaps Allied political will would crack before German military capacity did. Meanwhile, the Red Ball drivers knew none of this strategic theorizing. They only knew the road, the wheel, the endless cycle of load, drive, unload, return. Private Ruckert, on his fourth consecutive run, halted at a checkpoint near Rams on September 6th and simply fell asleep at the wheel while waiting for clearance. An MP had to wake him, and even then Ruckert was barely coherent. The MP, concerned, suggested Ruckert take a break, maybe get checked by medical personnel. Ruckert refused. His convoy was behind schedule. Men at the front needed what he was carrying. He took another Benzedrine tablet, drank cold coffee, and got back on the road. The human body can endure remarkable abuse, but it has limits. By mid-September, Red Ball units were reporting drivers hallucinating from exhaustion, seeing things that weren't there. Enemy soldiers by the roadside, phantom vehicles, entire towns that didn't exist. Commanders instituted mandatory rest periods, but mandatory didn't mean sufficient. 4 hours of sleep out of every 48 wasn't rest. It was just enough to prevent total collapse. Medical officers attached to Red Ball units began seeing conditions they associated with combat stress: 1,000-yard stares, tremors, breakdown of motor control. Except these men weren't being shot at. They were just driving. Just driving until their bodies and minds began breaking down from the sustained impossible demand. One medical report from mid-September noted, "Personnel exhibit symptoms consistent with extreme battle fatigue, despite minimal enemy contact. Cause appears to be sustained operational tempo without adequate recovery periods." And still they drove. Because across the Channel in England, factories were still producing supplies. Ships were still crossing the Atlantic loaded with material. Ports in Normandy were still being unloaded. The entire Allied supply chain was functioning, and the Red Ball was the artery connecting it all to the beating heart of the advance. If that artery clogged, if those trucks stopped rolling, the whole offensive would suffer a stroke. September 10th brought the first hints of relief. Engineers finally opened additional supply routes, taking pressure off the Red Ball. Port capacity in Normandy increased as more facilities came online. The crisis edge began to dull. Not solved, there would be supply problems through the rest of 1944, but managed. The existential threat of complete logistical collapse receded. Patton's Third Army, partially resupplied, resumed offensive operations on September 12th. They didn't achieve the breakthrough Patton had wanted. That opportunity had passed in early September, when fuel shortages forced the halt. But they maintained pressure, kept the Germans retreating, denied them time to establish impregnable defenses. The war would continue through winter, through the Battle of the Bulge, through months more of hard fighting. But the crisis of early September, when the entire Allied advance nearly stalled for lack of supplies, had been overcome. The Red Ball Express had done its job. Not elegantly, not efficiently by traditional standards, but successfully. It had kept supplies moving during the critical weeks when conventional logistics should have collapsed. It had proved that American industrial capacity could solve problems through sheer overwhelming effort that more sophisticated armies would have considered impossible. In German headquarters, the laughter had stopped. The intelligence officers still filed reports on American supply operations, but the tone had changed. No more dismissive remarks about amateur logistics, just cold acknowledgement of capacity that couldn't be matched. The Americans had shown that in modern industrial warfare, having enough resources to be wasteful was more powerful than perfect efficiency with limited resources. The invisible turning point had occurred. Not on a battlefield, not in a decisive combat engagement, but on French highways where thousands of exhausted men drove trucks around the clock. Wars are won with bullets and bombs, but they're sustained with fuel and food and spare parts. The Red Ball Express sustained the advance that would end the Third Reich. The German generals, too late, understood exactly what they'd been laughing at. November 16, 1944, the official end date of Red Ball Express operations. The convoys that had been running continuously for 83 days finally stood down, their mission accomplished. The port of Antwerp had opened to Allied shipping. Supply lines had stabilized. The emergency that birthed the Red Ball had passed. The trucks were reassigned to regular quartermaster duties, their Red Ball insignia painted over, their place in history not yet understood. The final statistics were compiled by logistics officers who could barely believe their own numbers. 412,193 tons delivered. That's 386,000 pounds of material, fuel, ammunition, food, medicine, spare parts, moved from Normandy to the front across 400 miles of damaged French roads. If you lined up all those supplies in 5-ton loads, the convoy would stretch from Paris to Berlin and back again. Roughly 6,000 trucks participated, though never all operational simultaneously. At any moment, 30–40% were deadlined for maintenance, meaning the actual working fleet averaged 4,000 vehicles. Those 4,000 trucks covered collectively approximately 40 million miles during the operation. To put that in perspective, that's enough distance to circle the Earth 1,600 times or drive to the moon and back 83 times. All of it on French roads never designed for such punishment, driven by men who should have collapsed from exhaustion weeks earlier. The human cost was documented in medical and casualty reports, though the numbers were scattered across multiple units and jurisdictions. At least 146 drivers were killed in accidents during Red Ball operations. Not combat deaths, traffic accidents, rollovers, collisions, mechanical failures that turned vehicles into death traps. Hundreds more were injured seriously enough to require hospitalization. Thousands suffered injuries that didn't make it into official reports. Cuts, bruises, broken fingers, concussions from minor crashes, all patched up and sent back to driving, because there was always another convoy. The psychological toll never made it into any official statistics. How do you quantify exhaustion? How do you document the mental strain of driving 20-hour shifts for 3 months straight? Medical officers noted increased cases of what they vaguely termed operational fatigue. But 1944 military medicine didn't have frameworks for understanding the psychological impact of sustained logistical operations. These men weren't shell-shocked, they hadn't been in combat. They'd just driven until parts of their minds quietly broke under strain. Recognition when it came was minimal. A few unit citations, some favorable mentions in after-action reports. nothing that captured the magnitude of achievement or sacrifice. The men who drove the Red Ball returned to their regular duties, loading ships, driving supplies, building roads, all the unglamorous labor that keeps armies functioning. Many of them were black soldiers who'd return home to an America still unwilling to grant them basic civil rights. They'd helped win a war for freedom and democracy, then returned to segregation and discrimination. Private James Rookard survived the war. He drove for the Red Ball from August through November, then continued in regular quartermaster operations until VE Day. He returned to Alabama in 1946, where he couldn't vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In a 1982 interview, asked about his Red Ball service, he said, "We knew we were doing something important. Had to be important or they wouldn't have worked us that hard. But we also knew nobody was going to remember. Truck drivers don't get parades." Sergeant William Scott was luckier, if you can call it luck. He survived the war, moved north to Detroit, got a job in an automobile factory, and lived a quiet life until his death in 1987. His children didn't know about his Red Ball service until they found his discharge papers and medals after he died. He'd never talked about it. When asked why once years before his death, he'd shrugged. What was there to say? I drove a truck. Other men fought and died. I just drove. That attitude was common among Red Ball veterans, a sense that their contribution didn't merit attention because it wasn't combat. The culture of military heroism focuses on battles, on courage under fire, on dramatic moments of violence and victory. Logistics doesn't fit that narrative. There's nothing cinematic about a man driving a truck through the night, fighting exhaustion and boredom for hours on end. But those boring hours, multiplied across thousands of drivers over 3 months, won the war as surely as any battle. The trucks themselves mostly survived longer than the men who drove them. GMC CCKWs were built tough, and those that survived the Red Ball were refurbished and remained in service for years. Some went on to drive supplies during the final push into Germany. Others were shipped to the Pacific Theater for operations there. Many were sold as surplus after the war and ended up as civilian vehicles, hauling cargo across American highways, their military history forgotten. A few survive in museums now, restored and polished, static monuments to a dynamic achievement. The French infrastructure took years to fully recover. Entire sections of highway had to be completely rebuilt. Bridges that had stood for centuries were replaced with modern structures designed to handle heavy loads. The French government submitted claims for reconstruction costs, millions of dollars in 1940s currency. American diplomats negotiated settlements, acknowledging the damage while pointing out that liberation had value beyond monetary calculation. Eventually, compromises were reached, checks were written, and France rebuilt. The strategic impact of the Red Ball Express extended far beyond its operational dates. Military logistics doctrine, American, British, Soviet, and eventually even German post-war analysis, was fundamentally rewritten based on lessons learned from those 83 days. The Red Ball proved that under desperate circumstances, brute force could overcome elegant planning. That industrial capacity could substitute for efficiency. That throwing overwhelming resources at a problem was, sometimes, the correct solution. American military planners took those lessons into the Cold War. The Berlin airlift of 1948-49, when the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, and the U.S. responded by flying in supplies for an entire city, was essentially Red Ball Express thinking applied to aircraft. Don't worry about perfect efficiency. Just fly enough planes carrying enough cargo that the sheer volume overcomes any inadequacy. It worked in Berlin just as it worked in France. For the same reason, American industrial capacity could sustain operations that would bankrupt other nations. The German perspective evolved in the years after surrender. In prisoner of war camps and later in memoirs, Wehrmacht officers who'd faced the Red Ball supplied Allied advance wrote with something between respect and horror about American logistics. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded Panzerlehr Division during the Normandy campaign, wrote in 1954, "We knew by September that we could not win, not because of American tactical skill. We remained superior in that regard, but because they could afford mistakes. They could waste fuel, waste ammunition, even waste lives and still have more. We could afford no mistakes and we lost anyway." That admission, that tactical excellence couldn't overcome material inferiority, became central to post-war German military analysis. The myth of the Wehrmacht as a perfectly efficient military machine crumbled under scrutiny. Yes, German forces achieved remarkable tactical successes, but tactics don't win wars when the enemy can simply replace every loss and continue advancing. The Red Ball Express exemplified the gulf between tactical sophistication and strategic capacity. Soviet military observers reached similar conclusions, though from a different angle. The Red Army had relied on railways for supply throughout the war, suffering catastrophic logistics failures whenever rail lines were cut or destroyed. Soviet planners looked at American trucking capacity with envy. Post-war Soviet logistics doctrine emphasized truck transport in a way it never had before 1944. The Red Ball's lesson, that flexible, road-based supply systems could sustain offensives better than rigid rail networks, influenced Soviet planning well into the 1980s. For the African-American soldiers who comprised the majority of Red Ball drivers, the aftermath was bitter. They returned home to a country that still practiced segregation. In the South, they couldn't drink from the same water fountains as white Americans. They couldn't sit at the same lunch counters. They risked violence for attempting to vote. The uniform that had marked them as liberators in France meant nothing in Alabama or Mississippi. But something had changed, incrementally and invisibly. The men who drove the Red Ball had proved something to themselves, even if white America wasn't ready to acknowledge it. They'd performed under impossible conditions. They'd kept supply lines running when the entire Allied advance depended on them. They'd done it without glory, without recognition, without even basic respect, and they'd succeeded anyway. That knowledge passed through black communities and families, contributed to the growing civil rights consciousness that would explode into the 1950s and 60s. Years later, historians would draw direct lines between black military service in World War II and the civil rights movement. The contradiction was too glaring. Fight for freedom abroad, be denied it at home. The Red Ball veterans were part of that contradiction, part of that growing awareness that the status quo was morally indefensible. Their service didn't directly cause change. Social movements are more complex than single causes, but it contributed to an environment where change became possible. The cost calculations took years to fully compute. The Army documented direct expenses, fuel consumed, vehicles destroyed, man-hours logged. But indirect costs were harder to quantify. The French infrastructure damage, the medical treatment for injured drivers, some of whom never fully recovered, the pension obligations for disabled veterans, the long-term health impacts of benzodrine addiction, sleep deprivation, and chronic stress. When accountants finally tallied everything, the Red Ball Express had cost roughly $300 million in 1944 dollars, over $5 billion in modern currency. Was it worth it? That question was debated in staff colleges and military journals for decades. Some analysts argued that with better pre-invasion planning, the crisis could have been avoided entirely. If supply stockpiles had been larger, if port capacity had been prioritized earlier, if the advance had been more methodical, maybe the Red Ball wouldn't have been necessary. Others countered that war never follows plans, that the Normandy breakout speed was an opportunity that had to be exploited, and that the Red Ball was the price of seizing that opportunity. The consensus that emerged, the Red Ball was simultaneously a failure of planning and a triumph of execution. It shouldn't have been necessary. But once it became necessary, American logistics culture, flexible, improvised, willing to throw resources at problems, made it possible. A more rigid military system would have faltered. The Red Ball worked because American officers were authorized to try something unprecedented, and American soldiers were capable of making unprecedented efforts succeed. By the 1950s, as the generation that fought World War II began moving into civilian leadership, Red Ball principles infiltrated business and industry. The idea that sustained effort, even if inefficient, could overcome structural problems became part of American management culture. Just-in-time delivery systems, continuous supply chains, 24/7 operations. All these modern logistics concepts trace lineage back to innovations pioneered during those 83 days in 1944. The military continued to refine trucking doctrine. The Korean War saw improved convoy operations. Vietnam saw even more sophisticated systems. Desert Storm in 1991 demonstrated logistics capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction to Red Ball planners: GPS tracking, real-time inventory management, predictive maintenance algorithms. But the fundamental insight remained unchanged. In modern warfare, logistics determines outcomes. The side that can sustain operations longest wins regardless of tactical brilliance. Educational institutions eventually recognized the Red Ball's significance. The Army Transportation School at Fort Eustis made it a case study. The Defense Logistics Agency used it in training materials. MBA programs teaching supply chain management cited it as an example of crisis logistics. Slowly, grudgingly, the Red Ball Express moved from forgotten footnote to acknowledged achievement. The recognition came too late for most of the men who drove it. By the time historians and military analysts fully appreciated what had been accomplished, the drivers themselves were elderly or dead. James Ruckert lived to see some acknowledgement. A 1984 ceremony honoring Red Ball veterans, a small memorial at Fort Eustis. But most of his comrades died unrecognized. William Scott never received official recognition during his lifetime. Their generation had fought and worked and then faded into civilian life. Their contributions known to themselves and their families but invisible to broader history. In 2000, the U.S. Army finally issued a formal commendation recognizing Red Ball Express units for their contribution to Allied victory in Europe. It was symbolic, coming 56 years after the fact when most veterans were dead. But symbols matter. The commendation acknowledged that logistics personnel, truck drivers, mechanics, supply clerks, were as essential to victory as infantrymen and tank crews. That wars are won not just by those who fight, but by those who ensure fighters have the means to continue fighting. The Red Ball Express ended on November 16, 1944, but its lessons never ended. Every military supply operation since then operates in its shadow, building on its innovations, learning from its mistakes, honoring its achievement. The German generals who laughed in August learned by September. History learned more slowly, but eventually history learned. The trucks are gone. The roads are rebuilt. The men are mostly dead. But the lesson remains. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones nobody sees, won by people nobody remembers, doing work nobody celebrates. Until decades later, someone looks back and understands what really mattered. There's a photograph in the National Archives, buried among thousands of similar images. It shows a dusty French road, empty except for tire tracks worn so deep they look carved into the earth. No trucks visible, no soldiers, no action, just a road. The photographer probably took it as documentation, nothing more. But if you know what you're looking at, that photograph shows the scar tissue of victory. The German generals learned their lesson too late, but they learned it thoroughly. You can read it in their memoirs, in their post-war writings, in the grudging respect that bleeds through decades-old analyses. They'd been taught to believe that military excellence meant tactical brilliance, operational sophistication, strategic elegance. The Red Ball Express taught them something different, that industrial capacity properly applied renders elegance irrelevant. That sometimes the crude solution, thousands of trucks driven by exhausted men on improvised routes, defeats the sophisticated one. The men who drove those trucks never thought they were making history. They thought they were just doing a job, a difficult and unglamorous job that someone had to do. James Ruckert driving through the night with his hands shaking on the wheel. William Scott passing a crashed truck and keeping his eyes forward because stopping wouldn't help. Thousands of men whose names never made it into history books, doing work that made every history book possible. Wars have their obvious heroes, the soldiers storming beaches, the pilots fighting for air superiority, the generals making strategic decisions. History remembers them because their heroism is visible, dramatic, easy to narrate. But behind every dramatic moment are invisible people doing invisible work, supplying the ammunition for that beach assault, fueling the aircraft for that air battle, moving the resources that make strategic decisions viable rather than fantasy. The Red Ball Express was 83 days of invisible work that determined the course of the war. It was 193 tons that never made headlines but made victory possible. It was 146 men killed in accidents whose deaths were as necessary to Allied success as any combat casualty. It was proof that sometimes winning isn't about fighting better than your enemy. It's about working harder, lasting longer, refusing to quit when every rational calculation says you should. That empty road in the photograph carried the weight of empire. German generals looked at those trucks and saw chaos. They should have seen inevitability. They should have seen the future of warfare, where industrial nations with unlimited resources grind down tactical genius through sheer relentless capacity. They should have seen their own defeat, rolling north on worn tires at 40 miles per hour. The road is paved over now. Modern highways cover the routes the Red Ball drove. The men are gone. The trucks are museum pieces. But somewhere in France, if you know where to look, you can still see the marks they left. On the land, on history, on the invisible foundation of victory. The German generals learned to stop laughing. The rest of us are still learning to remember.